The first person who initially used flint to attack his throat, ate a handful of poison berries, or purposefully lost his weapon in combat is unknown. We have no idea who the first person was to jump from a tall cliff or plunge into the ocean with no plans to return. The stoic philosopher Seneca is correct in saying that death has always been nearby, yet it remains a mystery as to why the earliest known suicide occurred. Was it a sudden urge or a long-term illness, an inner voice commanding death, or perhaps external pressure from one's tribe to conserve food and land? No one knows. Violence and recklessness, profound social isolation, and self-harm are not unique to our species, but perhaps the desire to not exist is. It is unlikely that Homo sapiens was the first to think of the desire to not exist, or act on the thought of it. Indeed, from an evolutionary perspective, this would seem rather arbitrary, given the sophistication of the hominids before us. But it is likely that, after the first time the act of taking one's life occurred, and others became aware of it, the idea spread to the minds of others. After all, human beings learn by imitating others. Societal views on the desire to not exist have varied historically, from an accepted and valued event to treating it as a sin or a crime, or conceptualizing it as the consequence of adverse circumstances or pathological mental states. Gladiators thrust wooden sticks or spears down their throats, or forced their heads into the spikes of moving carts in order to be the master of their own fate. Cultures have valued the notion of self-inflicted death. The Eskimo, Norse, and Samoan cultures accepted and even encouraged altruistic self-sacrifice among the elderly and sick. The Finns believed that, because of the act of taking one's own life was a sudden one, it was impossible for the living to make peace with the dead, and the soul of the victim was therefore particularly restless and spooky. The body of the person taking his own life was thus handled with wariness. Beliefs about the desire to not exist have varied considerably in ancient Greece. The Stoics and Epicureans believed strongly in the individual's right to choose the means and time of his death. Others were less accepting of the idea. In Athens, taking one's own life was not against the law, but those who did it were denied funeral rites, and the hand that had been used for the act was severed from the arm. Aristotle regarded it as an act of cowardice, as well as an act against the state. So too did Pythagoras. Gradually, both religious and legal sanctions against taking one's own life lessened. The courts and the public increasingly considered it to be an act of the unbalanced mind, rather than the result of weakness or personal sin. In the UK, by the 1800s, essentially all cases of taking one's own life were regarded as being due to insanity. Most European countries formally decriminalized it in the 18th and 19th century, although it remained an offense by law in England and Wales until 1961, and in Ireland until 1993. History has reflected in its laws and attitudes at least a measure of the complexity of this phenomena, an act against the self. Taking one's own life is also a violent force in the lives of others. It is incomprehensible when among the young. It is awful in the old, inexplicable in the physically healthy or successful, and too superficially explained away in the sick or failed. There are no simple theories for this human phenomena, nor are there sophisticated algorithms that can predict it with precision. Certainly, no one has ever found a way to heal the hearts or settle the minds of those left behind in its dreadful wake. But we do know a sizable amount about it. We know, for example, a great deal about the underlying conditions that predispose an individual to commit the act. Things that may play a significant role are heredity, severe mental illness, an impulsive or violent temperament, And we know too that there are some events and circumstances that happens in life that interact in a particularly deadly way with these predisposing vulnerabilities, like romantic failures, economic and professional setbacks, confrontations with the law, terminal illness, social situations that cause great shame, or are at least perceived as such. The overconsumption of alcohol and drugs also play a major role. We do have a lot of knowledge as well about who commits the act, the most likely age groups, the social backgrounds, and the gender of those that are most at risk. Yet we are less certain of why people do it. Psychological states, complex motives, and subtle biological differences are difficult enough to ascertain in the living. Determining the role they play in those who took their own life is something else entirely. Inevitably, the research literature on taking one's own life reflects the complexities, inconsistencies, and shortcomings in our understanding. It also reflects centuries of attempts to explain the incomprehensible act. No one who has had a close experience of this literature, the thousands of scientific and clinical papers in the last 30 years alone, as well as the hundreds of books and monographs, can come away with it unshaken by its depth and scope of knowledge. Wars come and go, epidemics come and go, but the phenomena of taking one's own life has stayed thus far. As an existential issue, it is a core problem for philosophers, medical professionals, and theologians. It is an issue of importance for most of us, regardless of what we do or do not believe.